Welcome to the Liberty Without Compromise podcast with Dan and Dawna Wilson. This is episode 4 in the series Power Player Pastors of Kootenai County. We're going in depth to uncover what's going on with the leadership in the largest and most influential churches in Coeur d'Alene. We've got transcripts from actual conversations, and I'm going to kick it over to Dan, who's going to bring us up to speed where we are now, where we're going.
Previous episode, we introduced in this conversation that we received transcripts, or rather we received audio, video from this meeting. It was obtained legally. We made transcripts, but we introduced a meeting that this parishioner of this pastor's church requested to meet to specifically talk more about Dan Wilson and my platform. And at this meeting, a third individual was introduced into the mix, and this individual is a self-described former Department of Homeland Security agent and as a political advisor to this pastor of this big church in evangelical, politically active church in downtown Coeur d'Alene.
Yes, and I would also add that when they present this idea of being a political advisor to the pastor, they say we meet, meaning it really is presented that there's a group that includes more than just this one person. And we know some of who those other people are.
We're going to talk about them a little later in a couple other episodes, but we're now going to dive into the continuing on this conversation. In the previous conversation, we learned that this supporter of Dan Wilson and parishioner, and very important, I did not send this individual like we were often informed by those that supported me who attended this church. They couldn't believe that the pastor would have nothing to do with me, that had not met with me. This conversation took place roughly 8-9 months after I had sent a personal email, which we read in earlier episodes, to this pastor requesting a meet to introduce myself to him and to get to know him a little bit. But this federal agent comes in, former federal agent. We call for ease of conversation Fed. So just to be clear, it's a former Fed, although we don't know if this agent is maybe working on the other side of the ledger as a contractor.
That's
we don't
the
know.
rub.
We don't know.
It at least begs the question.
Right.
Yeah.
But the last things that were discussed as our supporter wanted to bring up the Kootenai County Republican Central Committee candidate survey, and the agent ran a lot of interference for Norris, making excuses. The pastor, the same thing as to why Norris's answers were so vague and incomplete.
Yeah, the two were very unified on this front.
They wanted to discount a lot of what I had to say as impossible. There was, defaming ideas for the Deputy Reserve Program in complete chorus with D.C. Special Deputy County Commissioner Bruce Matari. And then lastly, there happens to be a lot of interference that is run on behalf of Bob Norris by the former Fed and the pastor as to covering for his deficiencies. Mm-hmm. So we're now going to join back into the conversation that we left in our previous episode, and we're going to be discussing more questions that this parishioner was bringing up about Bob and the promoting of Dan. So we're going to start out with the federal agent in this conversation, number 50.
And just to let you know, I have a ton more questions, but I'm not going to ask them because I don't want to take up all the time. I think those statements are awesome. I think anybody wants to do that, but then the question is, how do you do that?
Real quick to interject, we're talking about Dan Wilson's policies, not only from the Citizens Posse, but the Deputy Reserve Program, combating human trafficking, combating the illegal invasion right here in Kootenai County. So the Fed is trying to, as you'll listen, trying to minimize and downplay that Dan Wilson has any idea or ability to do what he says he wants to do.
Yeah, they've sequestered this conversation and the outline items that the parishioner wanted to move through. And again, seems very obvious that the Fed's moving through her own agenda to present kind of like playing a good cop on this side, saying that Dan's ideas are great. So then I'm now going to continue in her transcript response. So I think those statements are awesome. I think anybody wants to do that. But then the question is, how do you do that? You know, because I can say that I'm going to be queen of the world and it may sound good, but is it even possible for me to do that? So there are some underlying issues with some of those things that the probability of a local sheriff even being able to do that is the question. Whether it's immigration enforcement, because immigration enforcement is the authority of the federal government. That's constitutional. And the only way that a local sheriff or even a local police department can administer any kind of immigration authority is to be delegated from the federal government. And the federal government, since Obama, has not delegated authority to anyone except jails and prisons. And so it's not like, and so when you say, I'm going to keep this terrorist free, that sounds great. And we all want that. I think we want to understand is how. And how is that different than what the incumbent is already doing? What's wrong with what the incumbent is doing that makes Dan's plan better? But there's no plan. I mean, there's I'm going to do it. I'm Dan and I'm going to do it. And I love that. But how?
I'm going to interject and say once again, this former federal agent absolutely is misrepresenting the things that I was saying and lies on purpose.
On purpose.
Because as we're going to find out later on, this individual also went to a early town hall that I had on border issues back in January. But I have never said at any time that a local sheriff can enforce any kind of federal laws. Now, we could talk about the fact that under ICE 287G program, the county sheriff does have the ability to perform some of the ICE functions, but we're not going to talk about that right now. Bob Norris apparently didn't even know what that was.
But they're running interference for him, saying he's doing everything he can possibly do, and you've already proven that is not correct.
So once again, there's being lies said about what my policies are or alluding to, because it's a federal issue, and anybody that knows me, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, I've always said go after the NGOs. Go after the NGOs.
And there's so much word salad going on here that you're trying to have a conversation with a person that attends this pastor's church, and to have this Fed in the room going on about what the responsibilities of the federal government are and the immigration authority and
by the way, how in the heck does this federal agent understand what state law is? Just out of curiosity, shouldn't that individual stay in their lane? Oh, I mean, aren't they a federal law
they're
under
not
U.S.
even
code?
From here. Yeah. They're not even from here. How could they possibly know?
So the pastor after that former Fed, keeps saying former Fed, just so we're clear.
I'm going to do it. I'm Dan, and I'm just going to do it. I love that. But how?
Pastor says, forgive me. I think that's well stated. And with my experience, and I told you this on the phone, Bob and I have been working together very closely for the last few years. And for example, in this particular context, we've worked together on this, and I'm now more aware than I ever was before on what he legally can and cannot do, but even then have been very proactive in doing what I've asked him to do. I think I told you on the phone, he's never let me down. I realize there have been people that have been disappointed, and for a lot of reasons, but my personal issues, example, there was a busload of people being dropped off, and I called him and said, hey, go check it out. He went over and checked it out, and they were all legal. They wouldn't look legal to me, and if they weren't legal, what are you going to do? And so he has thought this through as well, and I get it, and I do appreciate it. There is some sense of protectiveness. Were you here last night for church?
I was not. The Fed says I was not.
Okay, and I'm gonna stop this right here because I want to point out a couple things to people. This pastor is alluding that he contacted Bob Norris and said, hey, I want you personally to go over and check out these people.
We've heard Bob Norris tell some version of this story at his town halls too.
And he says it was consensual contact. But here's what I want very, very explicitly made clear. Bob Norris, and part of his lying propaganda machine against me, because he knew he wasn't even addressing the border issue before I started doing it, right?
Not at all.
And you and I went down to the border in Arizona, the unsecure border, back in January, and we took footage of hundreds of military-aged males from Africa and the Middle East that we encountered while we were down there. No law enforcement, no border patrol. So he had to kind of create this, alternative narrative that he'd been doing his job. And he tried telling people that Dan Wilson's going to get us in civil lawsuits because he's going to illegally detain and contact people and violate civil rights. And I continually say it over and over again. That's not what I said. Everything that I was saying is absolutely legal, the angle that I was going to approach it. But here you have him doing the very thing that he claims that I was going to do, according to this pastor. This pastor is saying, I called up my friend. I used the power of the sheriff to go contact these people. He went in there, and what did he do? Was that consensual, or did he go up and say, what's your legal status? Because we have heard him over and over and over and over say, Dan Wilson thinks that he can just go up and demand people's identification, and he can't do that. Well, how does he even know if these people are or aren't? This pastor doesn't realize it by opening his mouth. What he really is doing by his statements.
Because Norris tried to, in future presentations of his own, talk about how much of a liability you would be. And again, twisting your words and making up lies about what you said. And then he's doing the
very thing that he's claiming that I was going to do.
Approaching a white bus and asking people their legal status.
So again, the Fed was asked, were you at church last night? The pastor goes on to say, one of our veterans went like nuts. And I had to hold back my own emotions because we have a major illegal immigration problem with our borders wide open. At what point do we end up reacting in a way that we cannot exercise? My emotions are we going to wait until they're busting down my front door? At what point do I say, no, you're not coming into my house? The reaction of the American population that are conservative feel the same way about the border. Nearly to the point that we're going to say, well, we're just going to create our own army and we're going to go position ourselves and our snipers and are going to take you out if you cross our border, and you realize you can't unless we're ready to have a civil war. And of course, none of us want that. And so these things make me nervous, inciting that kind of emotion in our populace. I'll use an illustration because my wife and I were talking about this in 2020 when COVID and everything was crazy. And, we were talking about civil war and what could be taking place in neighborhoods. And I said, I want you to put this into perspective. Are you willing to shoot our neighbor? He's a liberal and he would be my adversary. And all of a sudden you sober up really quick when you think about the horrifying nature. I mean, nobody in their right mind should ever want a civil war. The parishioner says, right? Pastor goes on. I mean, it's inevitable in some ways in my mind, but oh man, admittedly, this is my first comment that I'm going to say. It scares me a little to have a guy like Dan incite this kind of thinking because I don't know that he knows what he's saying, and there's a Bundy-like spirit on that. Do you know what I mean by that? Do you know what I mean by Bundy? Parishioner, the guy who was running for governor? Pastor. And some of the family issues that they had in their properties and friends of mine that went to prison. I mean, one of my very closest friends for many, many years, he went to prison for a long time. Looking to the Fed. Do you know him?
Well, I've heard the name, but I don't know him. No, I think we should stop right there and summarize. One of the comments I have is, how did we this is again, another point in the conversation. How did the conversation take this turn? You have a pastor who is doing something very specifically where they had a story that I would argue they pre-planned to tell. And what it does is it invokes emotion. It draws somebody in. Everybody knows, if you understand the art of storytelling, you talk about how you feel. I was terrified. This happened and I felt terrified. So he is very artfully and skillfully turning the conversation in this direction. And however does he go from something that happened at church last night? I mean, I get it. He eventually gets there, but he's using all of that to go back to Dan Wilson. My concern and the reason I'm afraid is that he could incite that kind of thinking.
A Bundy spirit. A Bundy spirit.
Yep.
Now, Eamon Bundy did run for governor, and his family was in, part of that Mailer Refuge standoff with the Bureau of Land Management. I was never a part of that. I really can't tell you much about Bundy. I did not personally vote for him at the time, and I'm not disparaging the guy. I'm just saying I don't even really know much about him other than St. Luke's Hospital sued him for $50 million, which I think is a load of horse crap. But yes, the pastor is now intending by his words, along with the Fed, to tie me into what they're going to call radicals, people that want to shoot their neighbors and to cite civil wars. And anybody that has ever come to any of my programs, any of my town halls, or any of my meet and greets, they know that I have continually said over and over and over again, we do our fighting within the foundation of the Constitution. We do it through lawfare. We do it through civil disobedience. We do it through defiance. We do not do it with any kind of physical measure, physical response. And I've had people that try to set me up inside town halls to say, I want you to go to war with the ATF, or I want you to shoot it out with the federal government. And I'm like, no, we're not going to do that. And then they get up angrily and leave. And they're obviously, in my opinion, Fed operatives. They're confidential human sources. The feds do it all the time. And, what we're seeing right here is the pastor in with this former federal agent who we're still not certain is not still on the books, maybe working as a contractor. And people should be asking this question, why this individual is so heavily aligned with this church and acting in this way as we're seeing. Why are they trying to tie the message of Dan Wilson, liberty without compromise for all people, into this militia movement?
And their best shot at keeping the pastor willfully ignorant is to not allow him to ever meet with you, because he can more claim, what's the phrase, plausible deniability, that he actually doesn't really know where you stand. And so the seed has been planted that you're somehow a dangerous person, right. And he fears that you're going to incite this kind of thinking.
And if he's telling this person in this meeting, how many countless others was he saying the exact same vile garbage to?
Yes, by his own account. He's an influential person, and you should have come to him first and all of that. So I don't know if you were going to say something.
Yeah, we're going to go on and talk about this guy that was part of the Bundy governor's race or standoff or something.
The pastor, because again, let me draw you back. The pastor continues to make this story personal, and listen to him in his own words. He is going to describe to you how this makes him feel.
So the pastor's talking about this individual that was associated with Bundy, and I believe the standoff that they had at the wildlife refuge. The pastor said, I led him to the Lord. I discipled him, and he had this, what I would call a Bundy spirit, if you want to use that terrible expression, which now I will ask for confidentiality as well. And I used to try to talk him off the line all the time. Dude, you got to stand down. You can't do this. Until finally, when the Bundy Ranch issue came up, he was there and ended up getting everything he owned seized. He went to prison for many years. I remember, sorry, this is emotional for me, really emotional for me, because I led him to the Lord and discipled him. And I sat outside that prison, and my wife and I sat there and I prayed for him and just wept and wept and wept, knowing that the guy that I led to Christ was behind those doors for what he believed, but he went out in the wrong way, and he overreacted to the point where he ended up going to federal prison for years. He's now out, but wow, I don't want us to become incited. And it makes me nervous, and I get it. This is why I brought it up last night. Sorry, I'm just taking too much time. But when the veteran spoke up, and by the time he had the microphone, he didn't ask a question. He went on a rant, and then finally brought it around to a question like, what are we going to do? And of course, my first question is, I'm a theologian. This is a Bible study. We are not like how are we going to protect our borders? Like, everything in me was calmly as I want to approach these things legally, ethically, morally, biblically. I lean hard in to the right. That's why I said if it was at my front door, what would I do? And that's why I want to tell Nancy Pelosi, take the front door off your house. If you're going to talk about this like that, then take down the gates and take down your security and just let them come move into your living room. Because that's exactly what she's doing on a larger scale. And we don't see it that way. But man, we can't react poorly. It requires so much careful, legal, ethical, and moral thought. That one, I'm sorry, I'm capitalizing on it. That scares me to death of a guy like Dan Wilson, because he's going to get the guys that are just right on that edge. They're going to go over and do the I'm going to call him John Doe factor. And man, that worries me as he turns to the Fed. Is that okay to say it that way?
I think it is okay. And when you brought up, pay attention here, guys. This is voice of Dawna telling you, pay attention as I read where the Fed's going. After that whole diatribe from the pastor, the Fed interjects. And when you brought up Norris talking to the people in the bus, they're not even authorized to ask anybody what their citizenship is unless they're processing them in the jail as part of their bio. And if they don't want to tell them, they don't have to tell them.
Well, Pastor, I don't know any of that. I did not know any of that.
I'm not saying that Norris did anything wrong. I'm saying that, and I watch the news all the time, and we talk about illegal aliens. The problem is that this administration, so they're legally here, so you can't. Well, you're purple. I'm sure you came across the border. You're purple. You're from XYZ country. We're going to deport you because this administration is giving them asylum status. It doesn't matter if it's Dan or me. Nobody can deport these people because they're here legally. So yes, we have an immigration problem, but this administration has made it almost impossible for anybody to do anything about it. And it's just crazy.
Pastor, were you here when we had Jim Jordan and Russ Fulcher the other day? Parishioner says no. Pastor goes on, you missed out because they hit on this pretty hard too.
Just to clarify that, it doesn't matter who the sheriff is. If the person is legal and they've got papers, you may not like it, but that's what the Biden administration has done to us.
Parishioner, right. But if they can find that there is a crime committed, or if they're involved in trafficking of drugs or certain money, or the way they're being brought here, if that's illegal or anything they're involved in, that's the way they can look into it. And that's something that Dan has very much expanded on in his podcast, which has been very good to hear.
Well, I definitely think that's something that Bob has been doing, because that is what the sheriff is doing right now. I want to stop here for a second. Mm-hmm. I, again, want you to understand that my belief is that the pastor took this conversation in a direction that the former federal agent did not want it to go.
Very clear. Yeah.
And so the instant she could allow him to take a breath, she redirects.
Because she's saying, well, by the way, he's not allowed to go, when referring back to when he called him up and told him, go talk to those Hispanics down at Walmart, right?
Yeah, she's going all the way back, which we covered in the last episode. Yeah. Mm-hmm. She's going all the way back to that because she knows that she cannot make it obvious that she's contradicting the pastor, but she is definitely there as his handler. And so she knows that she needs to correct this record before this meeting ends.
And again, they're attempting to somehow say that I'm going to side a civil war. They're saying the people that support me, that I'm on that fringe.
That's where the pastor was taking it.
So they're trying to defame me once again. Never have met with me. Never have talked about it. In fact, I almost think that's borderline defamation, really. And is it once again election interference when you have a pastor who should be not advocating for any candidate who's clearly running interference for a candidate? Running his mouth, and then his advisor, the federal agent, who knows very well what they're doing, has, as you just said, had to come back in and set the record. Well, you can't ask for legal status, and
they're going back, 10 minutes prior in the conversation and drawing that back because it was unfinished business and she couldn't leave that loose thread.
And attempting to say, well, this is all the Biden administration, so running interference as to why Bob Norris has not been active or proactive on anything.
Yes. He's doing everything. He's doing everything he can do. This is a problem of the Biden administration. And then I just want to remind everybody that after you've got a pastor and a former federal agent that are in this room having this conversation with a churchgoer, one of their churchgoers, parishioner. But what this culminated in is more recently and I just want to remind people of this because the pastor continues to claim to not be politically involved. They're just things he doesn't know. But what this culminated in more recently was that the same pastor from his pulpit called you
after the
post-election, called you a liar. And
he was stunned by the amount of lies.
Yes. And then he was
personally threatened by me.
Threatened.
He didn't say me again. He's talking. That's why we're not naming his name, although anybody that listens to this surely knows who he is.
Yes.
But yeah, you have this federal agent and the pastor running interference as to why he can't do anything. But the parishioner is very smart. And the parishioner says, well, wait a second. Wilson has said, but if they're committing crimes, they can then contact these individuals. And
then the federal agent says, well, I think that's something that Bob's been doing because that is what the sheriff is doing now. Yeah. Dawn on the sideline. Well, that's BS.
Going on. Pastor. Definitely, it's high on his register. Priority list, even though it's not articulated. That's why I want to mention it, because I know him and I know the way he's functioning in that arena. And so anyway, I've taken a lot of your time now.
I'm sorry. The pastor is privy to what is on the sheriff's priority list. And the sheriff gets an excuse for never articulating it. But just trust me, because I know, because he's told me, the pastor. And so I know it's high on his priority list, even though he's never explained it to any of his tax base, anybody in Kootenai County.
No.
Okay.
Federal agent goes on.
Federal agent. We are getting invaded, and it's just like we throw up our hands. And like you say, what are we going to do about it?
To your comment, if they came here illegally, well, they did. The parishioner goes on to say, if we had more local involvement of bringing them here, that potentially is a way of researching that more.
What is the violation of the law that a local sheriff can arrest somebody on or can enforce on somebody that's smuggling? That's a federal statute. That's reserved for federal law enforcement. Like it or not, constitutional or not, that's the way it is. And I don't like it, but actually constitutionally it says that. And even the way that it has been interpreted in the courts over the years, that's the way it is.
Yeah, we have a much bigger problem than we can solve locally.
Oh, yeah.
And the courts is a big start.
I've actually worked human smuggling cases where people were being smuggled across the border and then on into the interior. And so what that would take to get it prosecuted with the U.S. Attorney's Office would be you'd have to have 2 witnesses out of that group. They automatically get a visa to testify, and then they get bond, and then they show up to testify, and their visas can be canceled. But where are they? You can't find them. It's hard. It's even hard for the federal government to do it.
Because the broken system is broken.
Because the laws, the lack of enforcement.
By the time you catch and release, you have a court date. That's 3 or 4 years from now. And they have a free pass for 3 or 4 years, no matter what they do now, unless they break the current laws.
And immigration judges are administrative judges. And so they're appointed. And so you know what that means. Appointed by an administration that has a bench one way or the other. And so if you continue with a liberal president, vice president administration, the continuation of liberally appointed judges is going to continue. So all these people that have this temporary status in the United States will be easier. When their court date comes up in front of that judge, they're going to be liberally interpreted to, oh yeah, you have asylum or you have whatever, and you can stay here. So that's something you can't fix short of federal legislation, and it's frustrating. And if you can arrest all the bodies you want to say, let's say somebody commits an assault and Dan or Bob arrest them and find out they're illegal. One of 2 things will typically happen. If for some reason that person is given bond to wait for those charges in court, if ICE doesn't take them, well, ICE can take them and deport them, which means those charges stay outstanding and they never serve prison time for that crime. They're never held accountable. Or they come in, they're probably going to be given bond because the system's broken and those people know bond and they're going to respond and they'll never serve for those charges. If they do stand for those charges and they go to prison, once they do get out of prison, depending on what the administration, the federal administration's priorities are, they may be released right back out onto the street illegally, and nobody will deport them because if the federal government doesn't deport them, another caveat that people don't understand, and I just recently explained this to my husband because he didn't understand.
Hold on real quick. This Fed's husband is a former Customs and Border agent that flew helicopters and currently flies the Kootenai County Regional Air Support Unit. Is that helicopter that's not owned by the county, the one that I've talked about frequently.
Right.
That husband is one of their volunteer pilots. And so why would she have to explain to another former federal law enforcement officer or somebody that works in around federal law enforcement, because I don't know that he was an agent, but why would he not understand that?
Yeah. I think an attempt to seem relatable, or that most people just don't understand that. So I'm here as the voice of reason to explain to you how all of
and
this
she's, by
works.
the way, talking the way the Biden administration does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Federal agent continues. So if you have a person here that's illegally here from, let's say, Cuba, the only way that we can send them back is treaty. Cuba won't take them back. We can't send them back. If they're from Honduras, but they don't have any travel documents, you have to work with government to get that person issued a passport showing that they are citizen of Honduras. And then we can repatriate them to Honduras. We can't make them go through Mexico because Mexico is going to want to see their travel documents. So we have people that are either sitting in immigration right now that are either out of bond for immigration that will probably be here the rest of their lives because we can't send them back to their country because that's the political. So this is so much bigger than we can fix this locally. We can arrest everybody that's breaking the law. And I think that's great. And we should, because it will discourage people to not come to our community. And I think that Bob has tried to do that. I think Dan has the intention to do that. But the reality is, no matter what you do, you're either going to be hopefully teach that person that they can't live in that community and commit crimes, go elsewhere, but you can't fix the fact that they're illegal and get them out of the country.
And the pastor says, as much as we hate it.
Unfortunately, that's just the reality of how broken the federal government is.
Okay. Now, we're going to stop here again.
Thank you. Yes.
So a couple things. One, this federal agent is trying to come at it only from one angle, which is the angle of, local law enforcement doesn't enforce federal law enforcement. And we know that federal law enforcement or, borders and customs and ICE, who should be at the forefront of deporting, that their hands are tied, so on and so forth.
Who do you think the author of confusion is in this conversation?
Yeah. So we're gonna break this down a little more too. How are these illegals getting up to Kootenai County? How are they getting up to Spokane? How are they getting up to the north end of the country?
Certainly not something this federal agent wanted to talk about.
So because of the disinformation and the propaganda, which this federal agent is involved with, because make no mistake, they are saying this on purpose to try to defame what my position was, and it still is. These people are getting up here through NGOs, non-governmental organizations. Federal government spent $1.5 billion to these NGOs to start moving these individuals all over the country. We're not even talking about the polystability actors, those military-age males from Africa and China and the Middle East that are here and hiding out. But my argument has always been, we can't enforce federal immigration. Unlike Bob, I actually was calling back in April to be part of the ICE 287G program so we can hurry up the process of deporting criminals, because we absolutely can kick criminals out of the county. That's a fast track out of here. But more importantly, my message has always been, you start hitting the NGOs, those that are subverting the laws of Idaho, and you start hitting them hard through task forces, and you start seizing vehicles and making arrests and suing. We're entering into lawfare, but this federal agent is being intellectually dishonest, because that's what a federal agent is trained to do. This federal agent, former federal agent, is no dummy when it comes to interview techniques and interrogation. So why is this person who couldn't even catch a podcast, could never come and, as we'll find out later, could never come and really ask me these questions. You and I, when we were at the fair, I had a booth at the fair for 10 days. And this is right close to when this conversation took place historically. We're at the fair. I'm standing there and I see this former Fed and her husband, who's the volunteer helicopter pilot, formerly from Customs and Borders, walk all the way. They see us. Nobody's at our booth. They could have come over and both engaged with us. It was a friendly environment. We were just catty corner to the Kootenai County Republican Central Committee booth. They walked all the way around so that they didn't have to walk past us. We saw them. They were walking south past us. They went as far away from us as possible to not have to come anywhere close by.
Is that the behavior of somebody who's looking for answers, who's just confused and doesn't understand how you're going to do what you say you're going to do, and they just haven't had time to make it to one of your events? Is that the behavior that's representative of somebody who's being honest and who was giving you any kind of a chance to present your ideas and allow her to ask questions?
It has the appearance of a federal agent that's still active, that's looking to run interference against a true constitutional sheriff candidate who was endorsed by the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association founder, Richard Mack. And somebody that they knew would be very, very much pro-constitutional for all people, regardless of what your ideation and background is. So yes, this individual, it is my firmly held belief, was doing nothing but attempting to defame me and to basically deceive the parishioner and countless others as to what my real policies were.
Yep, and I think we're going to move forward in this in the next episode, because every portion of this has important things to be able to go over and break it down there, because there was so much going on. And what really the intention was to be an innocent enough meeting between a parishioner of a church and their pastor to have questions answered as to why are you stonewalling, and not by any means. They were they were confused by their pastor's behavior.
And we've had numerous other emails and other things that parishioners from this church have given us. So we're going from multiple sources. And letting the pastor even speak in his own words through his emails that were sent to me, if you go back to episode 1 of this series.
Yep. So thank you for listening to this episode number 4 of the Liberty Without Compromise podcast with Dan and Dawna Wilson. This is the Power Player Pastor series, which we will continue in the next episode. Listen and subscribe at libertywithoutcompromise.com or wherever you get your shows.